if we could go back to late 1860 into 1861, and we look at the decision by South Carolina and other southern states to secede from the Union, one of the things we'll find is that they argued, as we discussed in earlier lectures, these southern secessionists argued that they were forced to make this move, to leave the Union and form their own new Confederate government. And the thing that pushed them to secession was the coming to power of Abraham Lincoln, who won the presidency in 1860. These Southern secessionists argued that Abraham Lincoln, this relatively unknown politician from Illinois, was a radical abolitionist, that once he came into the White House, he would seek to end slavery across the nation. And it was this argument again that Southern secessionists would use to defend their breaking apart from the Union. Well, what this lecture is going to do is to prove the lie that was this claim being made by the Southern secessionists. Because as we'll see in this lecture, Abraham Lincoln was no radical abolitionist. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was not really a friend to the slaves throughout much of his presidency. He would only change at the end of the war, right before he was assassinated in the spring of 1865. But prior to that, we would see a slow transformation of Abraham Lincoln from someone who is more concerned about preserving the Union than he was about ending slavery. And this would continue, like I said, into the Civil War, as we'll see in today's class, which will end with the infamous Emancipation Proclamation, which, as we'll see, was far more limited than most people realize. Who was Abraham Lincoln? It's necessary to talk about his life growing up and some of his early views, which will help us understand the later President Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky in 1809 to a yeoman farming family. And the Lincoln family would move to Indiana before eventually settling in Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, for his part, was admitted to the bar in 1837 and thus became a lawyer, when he would move to the Illinois state capital, Springfield, to practice law. Abraham Lincoln would join the Whig Party and won 4 terms to the Illinois state legislature. He eventually became a congressman in 1846, but he would serve just one 2-year term from 1847 to 1849. And in fact, during this short stint in Congress, which again will prove the moderation of Abraham Lincoln when it came to an issue like slavery, during his short stint in Congress, Lincoln took a middle-of-the-road approach to the issue of slavery. While he opposed slavery as a moral issue, and this is not surprising because most Whigs did, and Abraham Lincoln was a member of the Whig Party, while he opposed slavery as a moral issue, Lincoln did not believe that the federal government had the constitutional authority to prohibit slavery. So therefore, despite fears that the Mexican-American War would lead to the spread of slavery, Lincoln actually supported military appropriations for the war, and then he supported the Wilmot Proviso, which would have prohibited slavery in the new territories, as we talked about previously. An interesting comparison here is Henry Clay. So whereas Abraham Lincoln, again, hardly a radical, actually voted to fund, give money to fight the Mexican-American War, his co-Whig Party member, Henry Clay, as we talked about earlier in the semester, was adamantly opposed to the Mexican-American War. So we can see there the difference between a more radical Henry Clay and the more moderate Abraham Lincoln. So what did Abraham Lincoln think in terms of slavery? He was actually a supporter of the colonization movement. And if you remember, we talked about some of the earlier incarnations of this in the late 18th and early 19th century with the American Colonization Society. And essentially, as a supporter of colonization, he argued that the freed slaves should be sent to Africa. So nonetheless, what we see here with this middle of the road approach taken by Lincoln, this young politician, this led to him being hated by both pro-slavery advocates who believed that he did not speak out forcefully enough in favor of slavery, and also abolitionists who believed that he was not on their side. So in short, because he was appealing to neither the pro-slavery people or the abolitionists, Abraham Lincoln would lose his bid for re-election to the Congress in 1848. So eventually, Lincoln would choose to go back to private life. He would go back to his legal practice, and he would stay out of politics following his loss for the next 6 years. He would return to the political arena in 1854. Why is that date so important? Well, because as we've talked about in 1854, of course, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act occurred. And Abraham Lincoln strongly opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it allowed for the extension of slavery. So what we are going to see is, again, this effort by Abraham Lincoln to sort of pick a position that's against slavery, but not for the reasons that the abolitionists were against slavery. Abraham Lincoln, growing up as he did as part of a yeoman farmer, was big on the idea that slavery should be preserved where it exists, i.e. in the South, but he was adamant that it should not extend into the West. That's why he opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So therefore, what we are going to see here is his belief that slavery should not extend into new territories because in his mind, those territories belong to the white yeoman farmer. If you brought slavery out into those lands and the white yeoman family went out there, the white yeoman family and their farmers and their family of farmers would make no money because slavery would be the preferred occupation. That would be what people would be hired for. And obviously those slaves would not be paid, but nonetheless you get my point. So nonetheless, here we see again Abraham Lincoln opposing the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it opened the door to the possibility of slavery in these territories, which he did not want. But nonetheless, historians have argued that Lincoln essentially resurrected his career in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, particularly during a speech that he gave in Peoria, Illinois in October 1854, known simply as the Peoria speech. And I'm going to come back to a piece of that speech on the next slide, so we'll get to that in 1 second. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about what happens to Lincoln in politics post-1854. Lincoln would actually play a key role in forming Illinois State Republican Party. And in fact, no one really epitomized republicanism more during the Civil War era as did Lincoln. He disliked slavery as much as any abolitionist, particularly from a moral perspective, but his desire to preserve the Union and the Constitution forced him to moderation. Before the war, Lincoln promised that he would do nothing to interfere with Southern slavery. In fact, he would openly speak out against slave insurrections, including attempts made by John Brown when he was attempting to raid Harper's Ferry and lead a slave insurrection. Abraham Lincoln was very vocal, publicly again, that he opposed such efforts as were being carried out by John Brown out in Virginia. Only later, beginning in 1862 with the Emancipation Proclamation, would Lincoln begin, as one historian has described it, quote, adopting the slave's cause. But even then, into 1862, it was still a very moderate approach. I'd like to walk back now briefly to that Peoria speech that Lincoln gave in 1854 in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because this speech, particularly this excerpt that I have on the screen, really gets to the point that I was making about how Abraham Lincoln was fine with slavery existing where it already did, in the South. He simply did not want it to extend into the new territories because, again, his upbringing in a yeoman family led him to believe that those western lands, those western territories, should remain open for yeoman farmers to make a living. Again, if slavery existed in those territories, the yeoman farmers' wages would basically be a pittance, and therefore they would not be able to live. And we see that here in this quote that I have up on the screen that I'm going to read here and then talk about briefly afterwards. Let it not be said, I am contending for the establishment of political and social equality between the whites and blacks. I have already said the contrary. I am not now combating the argument of necessity, arising from the fact that blacks are already amongst us. But I am combating what is set up as moral argument for allowing them to be taken where they have never yet been, arguing against the extension of a bad thing, which where it already exists, we must of necessity manage as best we can. So two things here. First of all, clearly he is not in favor of, again, political and social equality between African Americans and whites. And second, he is again against the extension of slavery into those new territories. As he says, beyond that, where it already exists, we must of necessity, he believes it's a necessity to keep it where it was, manage as best we can. Because he realizes that if you start to mess with slavery in the South, it will threaten the Union. And that was the most important thing in Lincoln's mind throughout much of his career until the middle stages of the Civil War. What I'd like to turn to now is, again, this sort of meteoric rise. Losing re-election to Congress in 1848, staying out of politics for 6 years, rising from the ashes in 1854, and only 6 years later, rising to the top of the Republican Party to become the Republican Party's candidate for presidency. So let's talk a little bit about the 1860 election, what is going on in not only the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party. And in fact, the Democratic Party is where I'd like to start because of its kind of complicated and splintered nature here in 1860. So in 1860, the Democratic Party held its convention in Charleston, South Carolina. Northerners who remained in the party chose Stephen Douglas, that Democrat from Illinois, as their candidate. And the reason why is because they were of the mindset that popular sovereignty was the best approach going forward to deal with the question of the spread of slavery. Douglas, for his part, angered many Southerners when he pushed for having Chicago as the point of embarkation for a railroad to the west. Remember, when we were talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that was the whole principle behind that piece of legislation. Stephen Douglas needed that territory to become incorporated into the United States, so therefore it was turned into Kansas-Nebraska, all because he wanted a railroad to be able to move through that area, and that railroad would be starting in Chicago. So nonetheless, this again angered a lot of the Southerners. Furthermore, Douglas favored popular sovereignty for the new states and territories of the West, which, not surprisingly, angered Southerners who, in comparison, wanted slavery expanded to all of the new states and territories without a doubt, with no election. They just wanted it set in stone right from the beginning that if there's a new state in the West, it would have slavery. And to go back to that issue of the railroads, the South was also angry because they believed that a railroad should not start in Chicago, but rather they preferred it coming out of St. Louis, New Orleans, or Memphis, acting as a location for the eastern terminus of the transcontinental railroads. So as a result, when the Northern Democrats selected Stephen Douglas as their candidate, the Southern Democrats responded by calling for a plank in the party's platform that offered legal protection for the expansion of slavery. Well, when Douglas won the nomination, what happened eventually was the delegates from the 8 southern states simply walked out of the convention. They would not accept Stephen Douglas, Mr. Popular Sovereignty himself, as their presidential candidate. Therefore, with the Southerners refusing to participate, the Democratic Party's 1860 platform, which was formed following an additional convention in Baltimore, called for popular sovereignty and promised to remain in the Union. So this is the more moderate wing of the Democratic Party, these Northern Democrats with Stephen Douglas at the helm. The Southern Democrats, for their part, held a separate convention in Baltimore, and they nominated John Breckinridge of Kentucky as their presidential candidate. Finally, you would also have a third group of Democrats, former Whigs and others, who would meet in Baltimore, and they would form what was known as the Constitutional Union. John Bell, a Southern slaveholder, was chosen as the Constitutional Union's nominee. So here we have, in short, three candidates running under the Democratic ticket, if you will. Stephen Douglas for the Northern Democrats, John Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and John Bell for the Constitutional Union. The Constitutional Union was the most unique because what that party was essentially trying to do was they were seeking compromise. Therefore, despite placing John Bell, a Southern slaveholder, as their candidate on their ticket, it did not take a position on slavery, and furthermore, it promised to uphold the Constitution and remain part of the Union. So, as all this was going on, the 1860 Republican Party convention went far smoother. And its platform in 1860, the Republican Party's platform in 1860, wanted to limit the expansion of slavery. Again, this is something that Lincoln had been talking about for years. But at the same time, nowhere did it call for slavery to be prohibited where it already existed. This is, again, direct evidence of the lie that those Southern secessionists were making when they claimed that Abraham Lincoln was seeking to abolish slavery everywhere. Interestingly enough, this 1860 Republican Party platform also included or supported public lands legislation. And these public lands legislation were put in their platform in an attempt to attract whites in the Midwest and the West, those yeoman farmers who were looking to move out west. Well, when the election eventually occurred, Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, would win the 1860 election with a strong 180 electoral votes. But here's the important part of this, and we're going to look at a map in a second. Even though he won 180 electoral votes, he received only 40% of the popular vote, so not a majority. Stephen Douglas, for his part, won just 12 electoral votes, but he did win 29% of the popular vote. So in short, we have a nation that is pretty much divided. But it's clear that the majority of the people either want to keep slavery where it already exists or allow the people themselves to decide if slavery should exist in new territories. Let's take a moment here to look at this electoral map from 1860. So again, just to repeat what we talked about, we have Abraham Lincoln as a Republican candidate. He is this sort of kind of pinkish color. We have John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat. He is the green color. We have John Bell, the Constitutional Unionist, the party that did not take a stance on slavery and also basically pledged to uphold the Constitution. And then finally, we have the Constitutional Union, by the way, is in orange. And finally, we have Stephen Douglas, the Popular Sovereignty Northern Democrat. He is in blue. So if you look at the map here, again, very similar to the 1856 election, in the sense that this is very much a sectional game of politics. Abraham Lincoln will win the North, and he'll also win California, which is not surprising because, again, going back to an earlier lecture, if you remember the Compromise of 1850, California was made a free state. And not surprisingly, again, because this is the era of sectional politics, the candidate from the Southern Democrats, John Breckinridge, he will win the South. More interesting here, though, is the importance of those border states that we talked about previously. We would see John Bell winning those states handily, and this shows they're kind of middle ground. They're not in support of seceding from the Union. They want to uphold the Constitution, but they also want to kind of keep the discussion of slavery quiet because they obviously are slave states. And then poor Stephen Douglas, he won a single state that he didn't even win his home state. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln, his home state as well, it went to him. But he did win its neighboring state, Missouri. But nonetheless, here we see again a very much divided nation between those in favor of slavery and those against it. We're going to pick up the story once again about this wacky claim, an untrue claim made by the Southern secessionists that Abraham Lincoln was an abolitionist. So let's take a look at what happens here. And what we're going to see, and this is something common throughout the war, is Abraham Lincoln is often pushed to act by the military. The military that is moving throughout the South and has to deal with the slaves that it finds during its military campaigns. So, though concerned with preserving the Union, various forces would eventually push Abraham Lincoln to take a more assertive stance against slavery. Since the beginning of the war, Lincoln had been pressured to be more outspoken against slavery by a group known as the Radical Republicans. These Radical Republicans believed that the federal government should play an active role in dismantling slavery and in promoting black citizenship and equal rights. Radical Republicans and abolitionists, in fact, often worked together, and they were helped by the rising number of slaves that had escaped during the war. So let's talk about how this came into play. Well, in May 1861, 3 runaway slaves arrived at Union General Benjamin Butler's camp in Virginia. Butler decided that he was going to label them, quote, contraband of war. And in doing so, this meant that he considered it enemy property that could be legitimately seized by the Union according to international law. So therefore, he would actually hold on to these slaves and keep them in the Union Army camps. Well, eventually what is going to happen is in another Union Army camp near Fredericksburg, Virginia, 200 African Americans would arrive every day. Thus, because of this onslaught, if you will, of slaves seeking freedom and seeking refuge and sanctuary in these Union Army camps, in August of 1861, Congress passed the Confiscation Act. This Confiscation Act authorized the seizure of all property, including slaves, used to support the rebellion. So now we see Congress actually acting again more forcefully to basically circumvent the laws of the land and free these slaves during wartime. Eventually, on May 9th, 1862, a Union general by the name of David Hunter, who was a military commander in the South, declared martial law in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And in doing so, he followed this up with a declaration that all slaves in these 3 states of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida would be free. So clearly, we see the military people in the Union actually doing more to end slavery than Abraham Lincoln in 1861 and 1862. As it turned out, another event on the battlefields of the Civil War actually encouraged Abraham Lincoln to himself take a more forceful stance against slavery. And that event was what we talked about recently, the bloodiest single-day battle of the entire war of Antietam. With this victory, Abraham Lincoln believed this was a sign from God, that if the Union victory occurred, something would have to occur to help the slaves. Something would have to be done to help the slaves. So nonetheless, when the North did win at Antietam, Abraham Lincoln decided to present to the American people his Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln, in fact, said during a meeting with his presidential cabinet the following, quote, "If God gave us a victory in the approaching battle, I would consider it an indication of divine will." So as that victory occurred, Abraham Lincoln did indeed take it as a sign from God that he needed to do something to help the slaves. And that something was the Emancipation Proclamation. In the Emancipation Proclamation, one part of it, the most important part, said the following: "All persons held as slaves within any states or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free." Now here's the thing, and this is so important to understand, because a lot of people misunderstand what the Emancipation Proclamation did. It did not end slavery across the United States, particularly in the border states. Remember, I've talked about this so many times when we were talking about the Civil War, the importance of those border states. Those border states joined the Union in the Civil War, but those same border states had slavery within them. They allowed slavery to occur. So therefore, Abraham Lincoln here in September of 1862, when he issued this Emancipation Proclamation, he realized that he could not end slavery in the Union, in those border states, because if he did, with a snap of their fingers, those states would join the Confederacy and possibly turn the tide against the Union in the Civil War. So in short, this Emancipation Proclamation meant that beginning January 1 of 1863, slavery was abolished only in those states that were outside of the Union, i.e. meaning the South. Therefore, slavery still remained legal in the border states, despite that being the area that Lincoln could have actually done something. Lincoln, as the President of the United States, which at this time in 1862 was just the North, he had no authority to deal with slavery in the Confederacy, which was basically a different country at this time. So therefore, in short, what I'm trying to highlight here is, as important as this Emancipation Proclamation was, it really lacked teeth to do anything. And in fact, even Lincoln's own Secretary of State, a guy by the name of William Seward, said the following: "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them, and holding them in bondage where we can set them free." Seward understood the irony of this situation, that here again Abraham Lincoln was making this dramatic proclamation that all slaves were free. But hold on a second, only those slaves that are in the Confederacy, not those slaves in the border states that are so important to the North to win possibly the Civil War. So again, just to end this lecture, it is important to note that it would not again be until early 1865 where Lincoln would finally come around to calling for the abolition of slavery. And sadly, his life, of course, will be taken in the spring of 1865, and he will never live to see the slaves free when it is abolished with the 13th Amendment, as we'll talk about in the next class. But nonetheless, again, up until that point in 1865, it is Abraham Lincoln who is walking very slowly, and it will take years upon years for him to fully come around to becoming an abolitionist. Long after the Southern secessionists claimed in 1860 and 1861 that Abraham Lincoln was going to become president and he was going to end slavery all across the nation. That it was a blatant lie, as we saw in this lecture, Abraham Lincoln was far more middle of the road.